It was a couple of months ago, back when I first released a video discussing a topic similar to this. It was essentially about what PC handhelds best compare to the Nintendo Switch 2, which at the time was only just announced, and everybody was talking about, oh, it's gonna be the Steam Deck killer, or it's gonna be destroyed by the Ally X. And I sort of took the position that the Switch doesn't compare neatly to any one handheld, and I still maintain that position. But honestly, if there was to be one PC handheld that compares most similarly to the Nintendo Switch 2, is the Steam Deck. You could also sub in other handhelds, but I feel like the Steam Deck just is closest in terms of price to the Switch 2, because there are other handhelds like the Lenovo Legion Go S, with that device being of a similar vein, a very console-like experience, but the price doesn't nearly come as close to the Switch 2 as the Steam Deck does, unfortunately. Hopefully this will change when the Xbox Ally's more budget-friendly white version comes out at some point later this year, but that still remains to be seen. As it currently stands, the Steam Deck stands closest to the Switch 2 for price and overall usability features. And now that I've used both these devices for quite some time, the Steam Deck going on almost 3 years at this point, and for my Switch 2, a couple of weeks at this point, review to be coming soon though on that device. We all know the Steam Deck at this point. The Steam Deck is incredibly fun. SteamOS is one of the most user-friendly and just best PC handheld operating systems to date. The Steam Deck has many usability features that drastically increases quality of life. Things like the touchpads come to mind, being a big factor in navigating desktop modes or even playing certain kinds of games like Sid Meier's Civilization, which that was a marquee title for the Switch 2, showing off its mouse functionality in the Joy-Cons. But in terms of physical design to design, the Steam Deck is quite unwieldy. It is large and in charge. It rocks a 7-inch screen. I'm using the LCD model. I have used the OLED and have compared it to the OLED, but I'll get into that later why I don't think it's that big of a deal. It also has these massive meaty handles on each side, perfect for amazing ergonomics. The controller layout, while initially very unconventional and strange, actually ends up being very comfortable. Moving on to the Switch 2's overall design, it's pretty large in its own right. It is a whopping 8-inch screen. The Joy-Cons, as always, are detachable, but these ones attach via magnetics instead of the traditional sliding rails we saw in the first generation. An almost entirely flat back, minus the humps at the top for the triggers. So ergonomically, I wouldn't describe this as great, but I find it comfortable enough to play for a couple of hours, which is usually the longest my play sessions tend to be, at least in portable mode. I would say in terms of ergonomics and overall physical design, I would give it to the Steam Deck purely because it is just so comfortable. It is thicker and heavier, but I feel like for the gains you get in ergonomics, it pretty much offsets that cost of the thinness and overall, largeness and flatness of the Switch 2. It's fine, but ergonomics sort of kill that device in terms of super long portable sessions, unlike the Steam Deck. The physical controls, of course, the Joy-Cons are detachable and have a mouse sensor built into them, which is cool, but for me, I find kind of stupid. So both devices have some manner of mouse functionality. The Switch with its Joy-Con sensors, and the Steam Deck with its touchpads. I would argue, for the context of playing games, the touchpads might make a lot more sense for some people, because when you're playing portably, you might not always have a surface to run the underside of a Joy-Con on them. So if you wanted to play games like that, like Sid Meier's, it might not necessarily be the most comfortable way to do it. But the Steam Deck with its touchpads, no problem. You have a trackpad built into your thing. So honestly, I think the trackpads and the overall controls found on the Steam Deck once again take the cake. Screens is a very interesting talking point. The Steam Deck uses a 1200 by 800p display. It's not the sharpest resolution out there. It's essentially 720p but a little taller due to the aspect ratio. It's not a bad screen by any means, but comparison to the 1080p 120Hz HDR with an asterisk display found on the Switch 2, honestly, I gotta give it to the Switch 2. Hands down is an amazing screen. Some people have complained about ghosting issues. I don't know if it's just because my eyes are bad, but I simply haven't noticed it, or I have simply got like a golden sample or something like that. But I personally haven't really experienced any ghosting issues. To me, the display is quick and responsive, and overall, I haven't really experienced any issues. The Steam Deck screen is stuck at a relatively low 60 Hz, which isn't bad, but by all means, it's not what we've gotten used to at this point, and going between the two of them is like eating some cottage cheese and getting a crunch in the middle of it. It's very uncomfortable to go from 120 Hz to 60 Hz. That might sound elitist, but that is the experience that I'm having. Now, you might have heard me say HDR with an asterisk. While the Switch 2 is capable of displaying HDR content and utilizing HDR when you are connected to an external HDR display, the actual built-in display of the Switch 2 can only go as high as 450 nits, which is simply not bright enough to display actual full HDR content natively on the display. You simply do not have enough brightness and enough saturation to achieve the actual HDR effect. Thus, claiming it to be an HDR display is a little disingenuous. I don't have an OLED on hand, but I have used an OLED before and have compared the two of them. The OLED, I would argue, is a fantastic display, but I much rather take the higher refresh rate than having OLED. That's assuming it is a high quality IPS type display. That is a caveat and trade-off I'm willing to accept. But the Switch 2 display allegedly has all these inconsistencies and ghosting problems, so some might argue that the OLED display found on the Steam Deck OLED would be a better display. But honestly, could really go either way, so I would say that the display portion of this really ends up being a draw. We've talked about ergonomics, design, display, screens. I won't really talk about the speakers. They're both fine. Neither of them are, oh god, these speakers sound fantastic. So we really won't be dipping into the audio portion of things. They both sound fine. I have zero complaints. I am no audiophile, so I'm sure most people won't have any issue with how these things sound. But we've covered pretty much everything except the actual experiences of playing games on this device. So how is it compared to both systems, the actual act of gaming? Well, the Steam Deck has access to Steam, so you have access to the entire Steam library, with the caveat that it may or may not be compatible depending on the game, which is very similar to how a Switch 2 functions when you think about it. When a game doesn't work on it, it just isn't on the system. So it's similar, but completely different at the same time. The library of native Switch 2 games at the moment is incredibly small, but the current lineup of games available include titles that have been out for quite some time and have been playable on Steam Deck, like Cyberpunk 2077, which first introduced a dedicated Steam Deck optimized performance setting, which, comparing that to the Switch 2, it's a bit of a stark difference. The Steam Deck is noticeably and significantly less powerful, but the Steam Deck does have access to a significantly larger library of games. Currently, Elden Ring is not out yet on Switch 2, but from what we've seen so far, that game is going to probably run pretty similarly to how it runs on the last generation systems, and at the same time, it's pretty similar to the current generation systems, somewhere in the middle in terms of visual quality and FPS. It's going to sit kind of in the middle. So the game's actually going to end up looking pretty decently with maintaining an anywhere between 40 to 60 FPS range, while still looking very pretty. compare that to what the Steam Deck currently does, it gets a high of 40, which is great, but it looks like dog water. I played pretty much half of Elden Ring this way, so it's not like it was a bad time, but it was sort of good at the time because it really was the only option around. Comparing games is really tough. It really depends on what kind of experience you value most. Do you want a higher quality, though far more limited, official experience with Nintendo? Or do you want a large library of games you could really lose yourself in and have access to anywhere? That's the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is ultimate flexibility, while the Switch 2 offers the best experience in a sort of isolated pocket. For me personally, I think just to the Steam Deck's age and starting to really have a lack of performance for more modern titles, I'm going to have to give it to the Switch 2. The Switch 2 is going to have a much longer lifespan, have significantly better official support by developers, which is sort of the line of the unfair comparison between the two. The Switch 2 will get specialized development, and overall just games made for it will be much more efficient and designed for its hardware, utilizing it to the maximum they could, while the Steam Deck has to still be a computer at the end of the day. It's running games designed to run on anything. Sure, there'll be the odd game with specialized settings for just the Steam Deck, much like Cyberpunk 2077, but that's going to be an exception, not the standard. And at the end of the day, things that matter most are the games. Nintendo will just simply have better options when they eventually come. Cyberpunk already runs and looks way better on the Switch 2 than it does on the Steam Deck. And as more of these titles that couldn't run on Switch 1 only make their way to the Nintendo Switch 2, the gap will only continue to get wider. And when eventually titles like from major third parties that may require anti-cheat when on PC would simply not be an issue on Switch 2. Games like Fortnite, Call of Duty, etc. will all have better experiences on Switch 2 than the Steam Deck, though some might not be there quite yet. Things like Call of Duty still haven't made an appearance yet. Fortnite, though, got a pretty massive update, and it runs so much better and looks fantastic. Comparing price points is interesting. The Steam Deck is currently $50 cheaper for the cheapest version. That comes with 256 gigs of storage and a standard LCD screen. The cheapest version of the Switch 2 is $450. Includes no game, and assuming you're buying it for your very first game system, it will have nothing for you to do without making the extra purchase of buying either the bundle or buying literally anything on the eShop, which could probably cost you up to $80 for Mario Kart, or as low as like $15 for some really fun indie game, which you could potentially get on something like the Steam Deck for like $5, given right now is the Steam Summer Sale. So if you're looking to maximize your dollar, save your money, and just play games as simply as that, the Steam Deck would be the choice for you. But if you like a polished, more organized and official experience, the Switch 2 is where it's at. I know right now, if I was in the position and I had, let's say, $500 to either buy a Switch 2 or buy a Steam Deck OLED, I think I would end up buying the Switch 2 just for the fact that the long-term support and library of games that in terms of how they will run better there than they would on Steam Deck. Even though you can play and buy games on your Steam Deck and take them to our gaming computer, which some people might not have. Probably most people might not have. And the primary reason why you would buy a Steam Deck is the ease of use in comparison to a Windows-based computer. So it's entirely plausible there are plenty of people out there who own Steam Decks but don't own a gaming PC. So the age and lack of performance as seen with the Steam Deck as it is currently makes me lean into the direction of the Nintendo Switch 2 for the average consumer. I would love to hear what you guys think though. To be honest, it can frankly go either way, whether or not you value your money more or the quality of the experience more. Love to hear what you guys think about this down below. Which side do you take? Other than that, don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All the other social media garbage down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.